The prison cell is dim, lit only by oil lamps casting shadows against stone walls. It is late afternoon in Athens, year 399 BCE, and 70-year-old Socrates sits calmly on a rough wooden bench, his hands resting on his knees. The air is thick with the smell of burning olive oil and something else, the acrid scent of fear, though not from Socrates himself. Around him, his friends are gathered, young men who have followed him through the streets and marketplaces of the city for years, listening to his questions, watching him dismantle the confident pronouncements of generals and poets and politicians. The stone walls are cold to the touch, hewn from the same marble quarries that produced the Parthenon's magnificent columns. But here, in this underground chamber, there is no beauty, only function. The cell measures perhaps 15 feet across, with a single wooden door reinforced with iron bands. A small window high in the wall allows a shaft of afternoon light to penetrate the gloom, illuminating particles of dust that dance in the still air like tiny philosophical arguments seeking resolution. One of them, Crito, has just finished speaking. His voice was urgent, pleading, breaking at times with the weight of emotions he can barely contain. "Everything is arranged," he said. "Guards have been bribed. 50 drachmas to the night watchman, 20 more to the gatekeeper. A ship waits at Piraeus, its captain a man from Thessaly, who owes Crito a favour and asks no questions. They can be in Thessaly by dawn. The journey is easy, a night sailing across calm waters, and by morning they will be beyond Athenian jurisdiction. No one needs to know, no one will stop them." Crito's hands shake as he speaks, and tears glisten in the corners of his eyes. He has been Socrates' friend since they were boys together in Alapes, playing in the dusty streets while their fathers worked stone. Socrates looks at his old friend with something like affection, but he does not move. His expression is serene, almost amused, as if Crito has just proposed something charmingly naive. Outside, the sun is beginning its descent toward the hills beyond the city walls, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. In a few hours, the jailer will arrive with a cup of hemlock, and Socrates will drink it, and that will be the end. The poison has already been prepared, measured out with careful precision. The executioner, they say, has performed this task dozens of times. He knows exactly how much is needed, how quickly it will act, what the dying man will feel as the numbness spreads from his extremities toward his heart. But why? This is the question that hangs in the air of the cell, unspoken but present in every breath, in every sidelong glance the young men exchange. Why would a man who has committed no crime, who has only asked questions, only sought truth, why would such a man choose to die when escape is possible, when friends have risked themselves to arrange it, when a ship waits ready to carry him to safety? The silence in the cell is profound. Outside, the sounds of Athens continue, merchants closing their stalls, children playing in the streets, dogs barking, the distant clang of bronze being worked in the armourer's quarter. Life goes on, indifferent to the drama unfolding in this underground chamber. But inside, the young men wait for Socrates to speak, to explain himself, to give them some reason they can understand. Socrates himself seems puzzled by this question, in the same way he has been puzzled by every question that has occupied his life. He claims to know nothing. He has said this thousands of times in hundreds of conversations, to anyone who would listen and many who would not. "I know that I know nothing." The paradox has become his signature, his calling card, the thing that both attracts students and infuriates enemies. And yet here, at the end, he acts with a certainty that suggests he knows something the rest of them do not. What does a man who knows nothing know about death? This is the question that will drive everything that follows. It is the question Socrates has been asking in different forms for 40 years. It is the question that began with an oracle that grew through countless arguments in the agora, that survived 3 wars and 2 political revolutions, and that now, in this dim cell, demands a final answer. Not an answer in words. Socrates has always been suspicious of words, but an answer in action. An answer written in the choice between life and principle, between safety and integrity. Before we go further into that cell, before we watch what happens when the jailer arrives with the poison, I want to ask you for something. If you're finding this story compelling, if you're curious about where this is going, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything to me, and it helps me continue making these deep explorations of philosophical lives. I'm also genuinely curious, where in the world are you joining me from today? Drop a comment and let me know. Are you in Athens, where these events took place? New York? São Paulo? Tokyo? Perhaps somewhere I've never heard of? Somewhere that didn't exist in Socrates' time? I love hearing from you. Love knowing that these ancient questions still matter to people across the globe, across cultures, across the vast expanse of time that separates us from that prison cell. Now let us step back. Let us leave the prison for a moment and return to the beginning to understand how a stonemason's son from an unremarkable Athenian family became the man who would rather die than stop asking questions. Athens, 470 BCE. The city is at the height of what later generations will call its golden age, though the people living through it do not yet know it is golden. They know only that their city has recently defeated the greatest empire the world has ever seen, Persia, and that Athenian ships now patrol the Aegean, that tribute flows into the treasury from 100 subject cities, that the Parthenon is rising on the Acropolis, white marble against blue sky, a monument to human achievement and divine favor. The victory over Persia is still fresh in memory. Old men in the Agora tell stories of Marathon, where vastly outnumbered Greeks drove Persian invaders into the sea. They speak of Salamis, where Athenian triremes shattered Xerxes' fleet, turning the narrow straits red with Persian blood. These are not ancient legends, but living memory, events within the lifetime of every adult in the city. Athens has faced annihilation and triumphed. The confidence this generates is extraordinary, intoxicating, dangerous. Into this city, in the neighborhood called Alopehe, a child is born to a couple of modest means. His father, Sophroniscus, works stone, a craftsman, respectable but not wealthy, one of thousands of such men whose labor builds the new Athens. His mother, Phaenarete, is a midwife, attending births throughout the district, witnessing both the joy of new life and the tragedy of death in childbirth. They name their son Socrates, a name that means whole power or safe strength. It is an auspicious name, though no one yet knows how strangely appropriate it will prove. We know almost nothing about his childhood. The sources that preserve his memory, primarily his students, Plato and Xenophon, care little for his early years. They are interested in the philosopher, not the boy. They want to understand the man who asked impossible questions, not the child who skinned his knees playing in the streets of Alapes. But we can reconstruct the world that shaped him, the experiences that formed the mind that would transform philosophy. He would have received the standard education of an Athenian citizen, basic literacy learned by scratching letters in wax tablets, copying passages from Homer and Hesiod until his hand cramped and the stylus fell from his fingers. Poetry, especially Homer, whose verses every educated Greek could recite from memory, whose heroes provided the models for masculine virtue, whose gods reflected both the best and worst of human nature. Music, learned on the lyre, for the Greeks believed that harmony in music produced harmony in the soul, physical training in the gymnasium, wrestling and running and throwing the discus, for a citizen must be ready to defend the city when called. He would have learned his father's trade, the craft of working stone, the feel of chisel against marble, the satisfaction of striking at precisely the right angle to split a block cleanly, the patience required to smooth a surface to perfect flatness. Later, some sources suggest he may have been a sculptor himself, that he produced works of some merit, though he abandoned this work entirely once his philosophical mission began. There are stories, probably apocryphal, that he carved statues of the Graces that stood on the Acropolis. Whether true or not, he certainly understood the craftsman's knowledge, the kind of practical expertise that comes from hands-on experience rather than theoretical study. The Athens of Socrates' youth was a city of extraordinary intellectual ferment, a place where new ideas arrived daily from across the Greek world and competed for attention in the marketplace of thought. Natural philosophers were proposing radical explanations for the cosmos that had nothing to do with gods or myths. Anaxagoras, a friend of Pericles, claimed the sun was not Apollo's chariot but a hot stone larger than the Peloponnese, that the moon reflected sunlight rather than generating its own, that everything in the universe was composed of infinite tiny seeds mixed in different proportions. These ideas seemed absurd to traditional thinkers, blasphemous even, but young intellectuals found them thrilling. Teachers called sophists arrived from across the Greek world, offering to teach rhetoric and political skill for a fee. They claimed they could make any student successful in politics and law, could teach the art of persuasion so effectively that weak arguments would defeat strong ones, that injustice could be made to appear just. They charged enormous sums, 50 drachmas for a single course, some demanded, and wealthy families paid eagerly, hoping to give their sons advantages in democratic politics. Playwrights like Aeschylus and Sophocles were exploring profound questions of justice and fate in their tragedies, staged each year at the festival of Dionysus. Thousands of citizens would gather in the great theatre on the slopes of the Acropolis to watch plays that questioned everything: the justice of the gods, the wisdom of traditional morality, the conflict between divine law and human law. Theatre was not entertainment in Athens, it was civic education, collective philosophical inquiry through dramatic performance. And then there was Pericles, the dominant political figure of the era, who transformed Athens into a democracy more radical than any the world had seen. Every citizen, not just the wealthy, not just the aristocrats, but every free male Athenian, could vote in the assembly, hold office, serve on juries. Political power belonged to the many, not the few. Pay was provided for jury service and attendance at the assembly, so even poor citizens could participate. It was an experiment in direct democracy on a scale never before attempted, and it made Athens both admired and feared throughout Greece. This was the world young Socrates inherited, democratic, intellectually vibrant, confident in its own greatness, convinced that human reason could solve any problem and that Athenian wisdom surpassed that of any other city. The conventional path for a young man of his class was clear enough: learn his trade, work hard, build a reputation for honest dealing and quality craftsmanship. Serve in the military when required. All citizens of moderate means served as hoplites, heavy infantry, forming the backbone of Athenian military power. Participate in democratic institutions, vote in the assembly, serve on juries when selected. Perhaps seek political office if he had the talent for oratory and the stomach for political combat. Marry, have children, maintain the household, honor the gods, avoid scandal, live quietly, work diligently, die respected. A good life, a life that would satisfy most men. There is no indication that young Socrates questioned this path, at least not yet. The philosophical gadfly did not emerge fully formed. There must have been a time when Socrates was simply another young Athenian, working alongside his father, learning to shape stone, thinking about marriage and household management, participating in the religious festivals that structured the year. A normal young man living a normal life. But then came the war. In 431 BCE, when Socrates was about 39 years old, Sparta declared war on Athens. The Peloponnesian War would last 27 years, devastate Greece, kill tens of thousands, and ultimately destroy Athenian power. It began with high confidence on both sides. Athens controlled the sea and could retreat behind her long walls while Sparta ravaged the countryside. Sparta's army was invincible on land and could destroy Athenian crops each summer until Athens sued for peace. Both sides expected victory within a year or two. Neither side understood what they were beginning. This would be a war of attrition, a war that would consume a generation, a war that would make philosophers of soldiers and cynics of idealists. Socrates served as a hoplite, a heavy infantryman, equipped at his own expense with bronze breastplate, helmet, greaves, large round shield, and an 8-foot spear. All citizens of moderate means served when called. There was no avoiding it, no buying substitutes, no claiming exemption. When the generals issued the call-up, you reported to your unit, you collected your equipment, you marched where you were ordered. To refuse was to forfeit citizenship, to be exiled, to lose everything. And here, in military service, we get our first clear glimpses of the man Socrates would become. Not from his own words, he never spoke much about his military career, but from the testimony of others who served alongside him, who watched him endure hardships that broke other men, who saw him face death with the same calm he would later display in the prison cell. In 432 BCE, Socrates fought at the siege of Potidæa, a brutal winter campaign in the north. Potidæa, a city on the Chalcidice Peninsula, had rebelled against Athenian control. Athens could not tolerate rebellion. The empire depended on fear, on the certainty that resistance meant destruction. So an army was dispatched to besiege the city, to starve it into submission, to make an example that would discourage other subjects from similar thoughts. The siege lasted for years. The Athenian army, encamped outside Potidæa's walls, suffered through winter after winter in conditions of extraordinary hardship. Supplies ran short. Cold was intense. Men lost fingers and toes to frostbite. Some died in their sleep when temperatures plummeted. Disease swept through the camps. And always there was the danger of sudden attacks from the defenders or relief forces attempting to break the siege. Later accounts describe Socrates' extraordinary endurance during this campaign. While other soldiers huddled around fires, wrapped in every cloak they possessed, Socrates walked barefoot on ice, wearing only his usual threadbare cloak, apparently impervious to cold that made other men weep. He would stand guard through freezing nights, motionless for hours, showing no sign of discomfort, while nearby soldiers stamped their feet and slapped their arms trying to maintain circulation. There are stories of Socrates standing in one spot for an entire day and night, lost in thought, wrestling with some philosophical problem, oblivious to the camp activity around him, to the jokes and speculation of his fellow soldiers. They would gather to watch this strange figure, this stone-cutter turned philosopher who could enter trances of concentration so deep that nothing could disturb him, not cold, not hunger, not the noise of an army camp. Some thought him mad. Others saw something almost divine in this ability to transcend physical limitations through pure mental discipline. And there, amid the chaos of battle, he saved a man's life. The man he saved was Alcibiades. Alcibiades, beautiful, brilliant, ambitious, aristocratic. Everything Socrates was not. Where Socrates was ugly, snub-nosed, bulging eyes, stocky build, Alcibiades was the handsomest young man in Athens. Where Socrates was poor, Alcibiades was immensely wealthy, one of the richest men in the city. Where Socrates was uninterested in politics, Alcibiades dreamed of surpassing Pericles himself. They should have had nothing in common, and yet a bond formed between them that would shape both their lives and ultimately contribute to Socrates' death. During a sortie from the city, Alcibiades, fighting with the reckless bravery of youth, was wounded and cut off from his unit. Spartan allies surrounded him, seeing a chance to kill or capture an Athenian aristocrat, a prize that would bring honor and ransom. Alcibiades went down, blood streaming from a wound in his thigh, his shield lost, his spear broken. He would have died there, or been dragged into the city as a prisoner, if Socrates had not seen what was happening. Socrates fought his way to Alcibiades' side. He stood over the fallen youth, his shield covering both of them, his spear keeping enemies at bay. For how long? The accounts do not say. Long enough for reinforcements to arrive, long enough that both men survived, long enough that Alcibiades never forgot the debt he owed. Later, Alcibiades tried to ensure Socrates received the prize for valor, the aristeia, the recognition given to the bravest warrior in a battle. Socrates refused it. He insisted Alcibiades deserved the honor. It was Alcibiades who had fought most courageously before being wounded. Socrates had merely done what any soldier should do, protected a fallen comrade. This was not modesty in the conventional sense. Socrates genuinely did not care about honors and prizes. They were irrelevant to the examined life. But his refusal had consequences. It bound Alcibiades to him more tightly than gratitude alone could have done. It showed Alcibiades a kind of virtue he had never encountered in aristocratic Athens, where every deed was calculated for maximum political advantage. It was the beginning of one of the most complicated relationships in Socrates' life, a relationship that would eventually contribute to his death. But the war also revealed something else about Socrates. At the Battle of Delium in 424 BCE, the Athenian army was routed by Boeotian forces. It was a disaster, a complete breakdown of order. Soldiers threw away their shields to run faster. Units disintegrated into fleeing individuals. The retreat became a rout, and the rout became a massacre as Boeotian cavalry hunted down fleeing Athenians. Socrates, along with General Laches and the young Xenophon, retreated in good order, calm, methodical, maintaining formation even while chaos surrounded them. Laches later praised Socrates' courage, noting that if all Athenians had shown such composure, they would never have lost the battle. Xenophon remembered the impression Socrates made during the retreat, the way he moved deliberately rather than rushing, the way he looked around constantly, alert for danger, the way he seemed more angry than afraid, more indignant at the rout than terrified for his life. There is a story that Socrates, during the retreat, would stop periodically and turn to face pursuing cavalry, staring at them so intently that they thought better of attacking this strange figure who showed no fear. The story may be exaggerated, but it captures something true about Socrates, the quality of absolute conviction that made even armed enemies hesitate. These stories matter because they establish something crucial. Socrates was no abstract thinker, no unworldly sage lost in contemplation while ignorant of practical realities. He was a man who had stared death in the face multiple times and had not flinched. He knew what physical courage meant because he had demonstrated it repeatedly. When he later claimed that death was nothing to fear, this was not the philosophical speculation of someone comfortable and safe. It was the conclusion of someone who had stood in battle lines, who had felt the ground shake as charging hoplites collided, who had killed men and watched friends die. War changes people. Socrates returned from these campaigns a different man than the one who had marched north to Potidæa. Not broken, not traumatized in the way some veterans are, but transformed. Something about facing death, about witnessing courage and cowardice, about living for extended periods in the simplified world of military service where survival is the only goal. Something about this experience clarified his thinking, forced him to confront fundamental questions about value and meaning. But sometime during these years, we cannot be certain exactly when, something happened that changed the trajectory of Socrates' life entirely, something that transformed him from a soldier and craftsman into the figure who would haunt Western philosophy for millennia. His friend, Chaerephon, travelled to Delphi to the oracle of Apollo. Chaerephon was one of Socrates' oldest companions, a man of intense enthusiasms and absolute loyalties, nicknamed the Bat by other Athenians for his pallid complexion and darting movements. He was the kind of friend who would do anything for those he loved, who would travel hundreds of miles on foot to ask a god a question about his friend's wisdom. The oracle at Delphi was the most sacred shrine in the Greek world. Perched on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the temple of Apollo drew pilgrims from across the Mediterranean. The Pythia, Apollo's priestess, would enter a trance, perhaps induced by geological gases seeping from a fissure beneath the temple, and deliver the god's pronouncements in cryptic verses. These oracles shaped history. Kings made war or peace based on Delphic prophecies. Cities established colonies where Apollo commanded. No important decision was made without consulting the god. And there, in that sacred place, Chaerephon asked the priestess a question. Is anyone wiser than Socrates? The answer came back, no one. No one is wiser than Socrates. When Chaerephon returned to Athens and told Socrates what the oracle had said, Socrates was bewildered. He knew he possessed no special wisdom. He was aware of his own ignorance on virtually every important question. He could not define justice or virtue or beauty or courage with any certainty. He did not understand the cosmos, did not have answers to the great questions that occupied natural philosophers. He knew his trade, knew how to serve as a hoplite, knew the poems of Homer and the basic requirements of citizenship. But wisdom? He possessed no wisdom. How could the god claim he was the wisest of men? Think about this moment carefully. Socrates had been raised to believe the oracles spoke with divine authority. Apollo did not lie. The god was a source of truth, one of the few certainties in an uncertain world. Every Athenian from childhood learned that Delphi must be respected, that the oracle's pronouncements were not suggestions, but revelations. To doubt Delphi was to doubt the gods themselves. And yet the oracle's pronouncement seemed manifestly false. This created an impossible situation. Either Apollo was wrong, which was blasphemy to even consider, which would undermine the religious foundations of Greek civilization, or Socrates misunderstood what wisdom meant. So he did something remarkable. He decided to test the oracle. He would go to those reputed to be wise, the politicians, the poets, the craftsmen, the sophists, and question them. If he could find someone wiser than himself, he would have proof the oracle was mistaken, or that the oracle meant something different than what Chaerephon understood. If he could not find anyone wiser, then perhaps wisdom meant something other than what people assumed. This decision to test a god's pronouncement through systematic inquiry was the beginning of philosophy as we know it. It was also the beginning of the path that would lead to that prison cell. Imagine Socrates approaching a prominent Athenian politician, a man known throughout the city for his wisdom and judgment, a man who has held important offices, who has made speeches in the assembly that swayed thousands, who is consulted on difficult matters by other powerful men. Socrates would approach him in the agora, where men gather to discuss public affairs, where reputations are made and destroyed through the quality of one's arguments. He would ask a simple question: what is justice? The politician would give an answer, confident in his understanding, drawing perhaps on traditional definitions, on conventional wisdom, on the poets or lawgivers. Justice is giving each person what they are owed, or perhaps justice is the advantage of the stronger, or justice is following the laws of the city. These are not foolish answers. They reflect serious thought. They connect to how justice functions in practice. They capture intuitions that most people share. And then Socrates would ask another question. A gentle question, seeking clarification, spoken with apparent naivety, as if Socrates genuinely does not understand and needs help. But what about this case? Or what do you mean by advantage? Or even if the law commands something unjust? The politician would elaborate, perhaps becoming slightly impatient with this strange questioner who seems unable to grasp obvious points. He would provide examples, analogies, further refinements of his position, and then Socrates would point out a contradiction, not aggressively, not triumphantly, but with apparent puzzlement. But earlier you said X, and now you are saying Y, and these seem incompatible. Or this definition seems to include cases we would not call just, such as, or this would make justice impossible because. Slowly, carefully, patiently, Socrates would expose contradictions in the man's position. He would show that what seemed like wisdom was actually confusion, that confident pronouncements rested on unexamined assumptions, that the definitions did not withstand scrutiny, that no one, including the man himself, truly understood what he claimed to know. At first, the politician might try to defend his position, to modify it, to patch the holes Socrates was revealing. But each modification would create new problems. Each patch would tear open somewhere else. The conversation would spiral, becoming more complex, more confused, until finally the politician would have to admit, reluctantly, angrily, humiliated before the crowd that had gathered to watch, that he did not actually know what justice was. And then, having reduced the politician to bewildered silence, Socrates would thank him politely for his time and walk away, leaving the man standing there, reputation damaged, confidence shattered, angry at this ugly craftsman who had just demonstrated his ignorance for all to see. He did this hundreds of times, thousands perhaps over the course of 40 years. He questioned generals about courage and discovered they could not define what made them brave. He questioned poets about beauty and found they could not explain why their verses moved the soul. He questioned craftsmen about their crafts and learned that while they knew how to do their work, they could not give a coherent theoretical account of what they did or why it worked. He went to the young, the old, the famous, the obscure. And in every case, he found the same thing. Those who claimed wisdom possessed none. They knew the words, justice, courage, piety, virtue, but they could not give a coherent account of what those words meant. Socrates concluded that the oracle had been right, but not in the way people assumed. He was wisest not because he possessed knowledge, but because he recognized his ignorance. The others claimed to know what they did not. Socrates alone understood the limits of human understanding. This made him wiser, not in the sense of knowing more, but in the sense of not being deceived about what he knew. This interpretation of the oracle became his divine mission. Apollo had commanded him, or so he believed, to expose false claims to wisdom, to show Athenians that their most fundamental concepts remained undefined, their most confident beliefs unjustified. The god had assigned him a task, and he would pursue it regardless of consequences. He pursued this mission with relentless dedication. He stopped working as a craftsman entirely. His family's economic situation suffered. They were never destitute, but they lived simply with none of the comforts wealthy Athenians took for granted. He spent his days in the agora, the gymnasium, the workshops, anywhere people gathered, asking his questions. He wore the same rough cloak year-round, whether in summer heat or winter cold. He walked barefoot through the streets of Athens, indifferent to the condition of his feet. He showed no interest in accumulating wealth or advancing politically. He attended symposia where wealthy men reclined on couches and discussed philosophy over wine, but he never got drunk, never lost control, never compromised his relentless pursuit of truth through questioning. His wife, Xanthippe, bore 3 sons, but by his own admission, Socrates was a neglectful father, more interested in questioning other people's sons than raising his own. Xanthippe's frustration is legendary. She appears in later sources as the stereotypical shrewish wife, though perhaps she had good reason for her anger. Imagine being married to a man who spends his days harassing prominent citizens instead of earning money, who neglects his children to pursue philosophical conversations, who brings home students for dinner without warning, who is famous throughout Athens but possesses almost nothing. When she complained, Socrates apparently responded with humor rather than remorse. Training himself to endure Xanthippe's tongue, he joked, made him able to endure anyone. People began to gather around him. Young men especially, aristocratic youths like Alcibiades, who found conventional education boring and sophistic rhetoric shallow, who were drawn to this strange figure who claimed to know nothing but could demolish any argument. These young men would follow Socrates through the agora, watching him question their elders, learning his method, absorbing his conviction that virtue was worth pursuing and that most people were deluded about what virtue meant. This following alarmed traditional Athenians. These young men, after spending time with Socrates, became difficult. They questioned their fathers, they challenged conventional wisdom, they lost respect for traditional authorities. They stopped accepting things simply because everyone believed them, or because the poets said so, or because this was how things had always been done. They became, in short, exactly the kind of citizens Athens needed if Athens truly valued critical thinking and examined lives. But Athens, like most societies, claimed to value these things in theory while punishing them in practice. The method Socrates developed became known as the elenchus, cross-examination. It had a distinctive pattern, recognizable to anyone who encountered it. Someone would make a claim. Socrates would ask for clarification. The person would elaborate, usually becoming more confident as they developed their position. Socrates would propose a scenario that seemed to contradict the claim. The person would modify their position to accommodate the objection. Socrates would find another contradiction in the modified position. Round and round, spiral after spiral, until the original claim lay in ruins and nothing remained but confusion and the recognition of ignorance. But here is what made Socrates different from a mere debater or sophist, different from those who used argument as a weapon or rhetoric as a tool for manipulation. He genuinely believed this process was beneficial. He called himself a midwife, like his mother, but delivering not babies but ideas. His questions helped others give birth to understanding. The pain of having one's beliefs demolished was necessary, like the pain of childbirth, because only after clearing away false knowledge could true wisdom begin to emerge. Most people did not appreciate this service. Imagine being a respected politician, confident in your understanding of justice, publicly humiliated by a stonemason who wears the same dirty cloak every day and walks barefoot through the streets like a beggar. Imagine being a famous poet, celebrated for your wisdom, whose verses are performed at festivals and quoted in symposia, reduced to stammering silence by Socrates' relentless questions, unable to explain why your beautiful words move the soul or what makes them beautiful. Imagine being a wealthy craftsman, proud of your expertise, the best in Athens at your trade, shown that you cannot even define your own craft coherently, that you know how to do what you do, but not why it works, or what principles govern your success. These men did not feel enlightened. They felt angry, humiliated, resentful. They had worked their entire lives to build reputations, to achieve respect, to master their fields, And this ugly philosopher, this man who owned nothing and knew nothing and contributed nothing to the city, had just destroyed their authority in front of an audience of young men who would spread the story throughout Athens. And they were powerful men, men with influence, with resources, with friends in high places, with long memories and patient malice. Socrates was making enemies, dangerous enemies, enemies who would wait for the right moment, who would remember every humiliation, who would eventually find a way to strike back. But he continued anyway, because he believed the oracle had given him a divine command, and to abandon that command would be impiety greater than any crime of which he might be accused. In 493 BCE, the playwright Aristophanes produced a comedy called The Clouds. It premiered at the festival of Dionysus, performed before thousands of Athenian citizens, and it depicted Socrates as a charlatan who ran a school called the Thinkery, where he taught young men to make the weaker argument appear stronger, to cheat creditors, to dishonor their parents. The Socrates of the play studied clouds and stars, conducted absurd pseudo-scientific experiments, claimed that Zeus did not exist, and that the clouds were gods, and accepted payment for instruction in rhetoric and sophistry. None of this was accurate. The historical Socrates never charged fees, never claimed to teach anything, explicitly rejected natural philosophy as a waste of time, never established a school with a physical location, and was deeply concerned with piety and honoring the gods. But to the average Athenian watching the play, the distinction between Socrates and the sophists he criticized was invisible. They both questioned traditional values. They both confused people with clever arguments. They both attracted aristocratic youth who then became difficult and disrespectful. The nuances, the genuine differences between Socrates and the sophists were lost on the crowd roaring with laughter at the ridiculous figure on stage. The play was popular. People quoted its jokes in the agora. The image it created, Socrates as impious corrupter, as charlatan sophist, as dangerous influence on youth, lodged in the Athenian imagination like a splinter, festering, poisoning the well of public opinion. 24 years later, at his trial, Socrates would still be fighting against the accusations Aristophanes had made comedy. But larger forces were at work, forces beyond philosophical debate or theatrical mockery, forces that would make Socrates' destruction almost inevitable. Athens was losing the war. The great expedition to Sicily in 415 BCE, championed by Alcibiades, Socrates' former student, and the man whose life Socrates had saved at Potidæa, ended in catastrophic defeat. 40,000 Athenian soldiers and sailors sailed west with dreams of conquest, with plans to subjugate Sicily and use its resources to crush Sparta. Instead, they were destroyed. Thousands died in battle. Thousands more were captured and worked to death in Syracusan quarries or sold into slavery. The entire fleet was lost. Athens' military power was shattered in a single campaign, and the city would never fully recover. And Alcibiades himself betrayed Athens. Just before the expedition sailed, someone vandalized the Hermae, the phallic statues of Hermes that stood throughout Athens, as protective talismans. It was sacrilege, blasphemy, an act that terrified the superstitious city. Alcibiades was accused of involvement, accused of participating in mock celebrations of the sacred mysteries, accused of impiety. Rather than face trial, he defected to Sparta, gave the enemy military advice that cost Athenian lives, urged the Spartans to fortify a permanent base in Athenian territory that would ravage the countryside year-round. The brilliant, beautiful youth Socrates had saved and taught had become Athens' most dangerous enemy. And people noticed. People remembered that Alcibiades had spent years in Socrates' company, that he had been Socrates' companion and student, that whatever strange philosophy Socrates taught had shaped this traitor. Then in 404 BCE, Athens finally surrendered. After 27 years of war, the city could fight no longer. Spartan troops tore down the long walls that had protected Athens for decades, the walls that symbolized Athenian security and independence. A Spartan admiral imposed a new government, the 30 Tyrants, an oligarchy of aristocratic Athenians who suspended democracy and began a reign of terror. Among the 30 was another of Socrates' former associates, Critias. Critias was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly convinced that democracy had failed Athens. He was also a talented poet and philosopher, a man who had studied with Socrates and absorbed his critiques of democratic politics, his arguments that expertise should govern rather than majority opinion, his skepticism about whether the many could know what was truly good for the city. Under his leadership, the 30 killed perhaps 500 Athenians without trial, confiscated property from wealthy citizens to fund their regime, and ruled through fear and violence. And Socrates, who had spent decades questioning the powerful, who had shown no fear of expressing unpopular opinions, who had embarrassed politicians and generals, Socrates did nothing to stop them. Or rather, he did one thing. The 30 ordered Socrates and 4 other men to arrest Leon of Salamis, an innocent man they intended to execute for his property. The other 4 obeyed. They went to Salamis, arrested Leon, brought him back to Athens, and delivered him to his death. But Socrates refused. He simply went home. It was an act of extraordinary courage. The 30 were executing people for far less than explicit disobedience. If they had not fallen from power shortly afterward, democracy was restored in 403 BCE. After barely 8 months of tyranny, Socrates would almost certainly have been killed for his refusal to obey their criminal command. But he survived. The democracy returned. The city tried to heal from civil war, from the trauma of defeat, from the divisions that had nearly destroyed it. An amnesty was declared, no prosecutions for actions during the tyranny. The goal was reconciliation, forgetting, moving forward rather than dwelling on the horrors of the recent past. And for 5 years, Socrates continued his mission. Walking through the agora, questioning, teaching, demolishing false claims to knowledge, as if nothing had changed, as if the war and the tyranny and the chaos had not happened, as if Athens could simply return to the way things were before everything fell apart. But the resentments had not disappeared. They had simply gone underground, waiting for the amnesty to expire, waiting for the right moment, waiting for enough time to pass that revenge could be taken without violating the sacred oath of reconciliation. 2 of Socrates' former associates, Alcibiades and Critias, had done enormous harm to Athens. One had betrayed the city to its enemies, had given Sparta the military advice that prolonged the war and increased Athenian suffering. The other had imposed tyranny and slaughtered citizens, had turned Athens into a place of fear where men were killed for their wealth and property seized without trial, and both had spent years in Socrates' company, listening to his questions, absorbing his ideas, learning to question democratic institutions and traditional morality. The Athenian people looked at this and drew a conclusion. Socrates corrupted the youth. His questioning of traditional values, his criticism of democracy, his association with aristocratic young men who then became traitors and tyrants, all of this suggested that Socrates was dangerous, that his philosophy produced bad citizens, that Athens would be safer if he were silenced. In 399 BCE, 3 men brought formal charges against Socrates. Meletus, a poet, representing the poets whom Socrates had humiliated, whom he had questioned about their wisdom and found wanting, whom he had shown could not explain what made their verses beautiful or how they produced their effects. Anytus, a democratic politician and wealthy tanner, representing the political class Socrates had questioned, the men who had suffered through his cross-examinations in the agora, who had watched their sons become difficult after spending time with him. Lycon, an orator representing the teachers of rhetoric Socrates had criticized, the sophists who charged enormous fees while Socrates offered his conversations for free, the men whose livelihoods depended on claiming They could teach virtue and political success. The charges: impiety, not believing in the gods the city believes in, introducing new divinities; corruption, corrupting the youth of Athens; the penalty they sought, death. The charges were carefully constructed. They fell just outside the amnesty because they concerned ongoing behavior rather than specific past actions. They appealed to persistent prejudices, the memory of Aristophanes' play, the associations with Alcibiades and Critias, the discomfort many Athenians felt when watching Socrates demolish someone's confident claims. They were vague enough to be difficult to refute, but specific enough to seem legitimate. Socrates could have fled. Many philosophers before him had left Athens when threatened. He had friends in other cities who would have welcomed him. He could have simply walked away, continued his philosophical conversations in Thebes or Thessaly or anywhere else, lived out his remaining years in peace. He could have kept silent, could have stopped his questioning, could have promised the prosecutors that he would cease his philosophical activities if they withdrew the charges. He could have tried to placate his enemies, could have used the political connections his students possessed, could have called in favors, could have negotiated some face-saving compromise that would have allowed everyone to back down. He did none of these things. Instead, he appeared at his trial and did something extraordinary. He told the truth. 500 jurors assembled to hear the case. This was standard Athenian procedure, large juries to prevent corruption, to ensure that verdicts reflected genuine community judgment rather than the opinion of a few men. 500 citizens, selected by lot from those who had volunteered for jury service, ordinary Athenians from every neighborhood and every social class, men who knew Socrates by reputation if not personally, men who would decide whether he lived or died. Meletus presented the prosecution's case. We do not have his speech, but we can reconstruct its likely arguments from Socrates' response. Socrates does not believe in the gods. He has said Zeus does not exist. He has introduced new divinities like his daimonion. Socrates corrupts the youth. They become disrespectful after associating with him. They question their fathers and the city's traditions and look at the results. Alcibiades, Critias, traitors and tyrants who learned their disregard for law from Socrates. The arguments were not subtle, but they did not need to be. They touched raw nerves in a city still traumatized by war and civil conflict, still trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. And then Socrates spoke in his own defense. We have his speech preserved by Plato in a work called The Apology, though apology here means defense, not expression of regret. How accurate is Plato's version? We cannot be certain. Xenophon also preserved a version of the defense, different in many details, and other students of Socrates wrote their own accounts, now lost. But Plato's apology is the version that survived, the version that shaped how every subsequent generation understood what happened in that courtroom. Socrates began by acknowledging that he had been slandered for years, that the image of him as an impious sophist had taken root long before these formal charges. He referred to Aristophanes' play, performed 24 years earlier, as evidence of the old accusations he had to combat. The really difficult task, he told the jury, was not defending himself against Meletus, but overcoming decades of prejudice, of rumors, of theatrical mockery that had shaped public opinion. Then he told the story of the oracle, how Chaerephon had asked if anyone was wiser than Socrates, how the priestess had said no, how this had puzzled him, how he had spent his life trying to understand what the god meant by testing those reputed to be wise. He explained his method of questioning, his conclusion that human wisdom amounts to very little, his belief that the oracle had given him a divine mission to expose false claims to knowledge. The god had commanded him, he said, to examine himself and others, to show people that they did not know what they thought they knew. How could abandoning that mission be anything but impiety? How could he ignore a divine command to placate human prosecutors? And then he said something remarkable, something that sealed his fate. I will never stop philosophizing, even if you order me to. Even if you threaten me with death, I will continue to question anyone I meet, to examine their lives, to tell them that wealth and reputation mean nothing compared to the care of the soul. The unexamined life, he said, is not worth living for a human being. Think about what he was doing. He stood before 500 men who held his life in their hands, and instead of begging for mercy, instead of flattering them, instead of doing anything conventional wisdom suggested might save himself, he told them he would never stop doing the thing they wanted him to stop doing. He would disobey any order to cease philosophizing because such an order would require him to abandon his divine mission. He would continue questioning, continue examining, continue showing people their ignorance until the day he died. Whether that day came naturally or by execution, it was either profoundly courageous or profoundly foolish, and with Socrates it is often impossible to tell the difference. He addressed the specific charges. Did he not believe in the gods? Of course he believed in the gods. He had a daimonion that guided him. He performed all required sacrifices. He argued for piety and divine wisdom. Meletus's charge contradicted itself, accusing him simultaneously of atheism and of introducing new divinities. Which was it? Did he believe in no gods or in new gods? Meletus could not have it both ways. Did he corrupt the youth? Who then improves them? Meletus claimed everyone else improved them, the assembly, the jurors, ordinary citizens, and Socrates alone corrupted them. But this was absurd. In every other field, expertise was rare and most people lacked it. Why would moral education be different? Why would everyone except Socrates know how to make young people virtuous? The arguments were clever, perhaps too clever. Socrates was demonstrating the very thing that made him dangerous, his ability to make conventional positions look foolish, to expose the contradictions in common sense, to show that most people had never really thought through their confident beliefs. The jury was not moved by cleverness. They did not want philosophy. They wanted reassurance that Socrates would stop making them uncomfortable. The jury voted. By Athenian law, conviction required only a simple majority. The vote was close, approximately 280 to convict, 220 to acquit. In a jury of 500, this meant about 56% for conviction, 44% for acquittal. Socrates was found guilty, but only barely. But the process was not over. In Athenian trials, if the jury convicted, they then had to choose between the penalty proposed by the prosecution and a counter-penalty proposed by the defendant. Death versus whatever alternative Socrates suggested. Here was Socrates' opportunity to save his life. He could propose exile, leave Athens, live out his remaining years somewhere else. He could propose a substantial fine. His wealthy students would pay it gladly. The jury, having convicted him by a relatively narrow margin, would almost certainly prefer a lesser punishment to execution. Many jurors had voted to convict to make a point, to warn Socrates to stop his activities, not because they genuinely wanted him dead. Instead, Socrates proposed that Athens should reward him with free meals in the Prytaneum for life, the honor given to Olympic victors and great benefactors of the city. The jury was outraged. They had just convicted him of corrupting youth and impiety, and his response was to claim he deserved the city's highest honor. What kind of defense was this? What kind of respect for the court did this show? Socrates explained his reasoning. He had genuinely benefited Athens by exposing false claims to wisdom, by urging citizens to care for their souls, by living a life of virtue and poverty, while questioning those who valued wealth and reputation. He deserved reward, not punishment. But the jury heard only arrogance, only contempt for their verdict, only confirmation that Socrates was everything his prosecutors claimed. When his friends convinced him this was suicidal, Socrates grudgingly proposed a small fine, 1 mina of silver, later increased to 30 minae when his wealthy students offered to pay. But even 30 minae was clearly insulting given his students' resources. It was an amount that said, "I am innocent, and I offer this only to satisfy convention, but I will not pretend I deserve punishment for living a philosophical life." The jury voted again. This time the margin widened. Approximately 360 voted for death, only 140 for the alternative. 80 jurors who had voted to acquit on the first ballot now voted for execution. Socrates had essentially talked himself into death. Why? This is one of the great mysteries of his life. Some scholars argue he was deliberately seeking martyrdom, that he saw his death as the completion of his philosophical mission. Others suggest he genuinely could not bring himself to admit wrongdoing when he believed he had done nothing wrong. Still others think he simply misread the jury, failed to understand the politics of the moment, overestimated how much his philosophical arguments would persuade ordinary citizens. Socrates himself offered an explanation. After the death sentence was pronounced, he addressed those jurors who had voted to acquit. He told them that death might be the greatest of blessings, either an eternal dreamless sleep, which would be peaceful, or a journey to another place where he could continue questioning the great figures of the past. Homer, Hesiod, the heroes of Troy, imagine the conversations. Either way, nothing to fear. Death was either oblivion, which cannot harm anyone since you do not exist to experience it, or continued existence with better interlocutors than Athens provided. What rational person would fear such a thing? He was sentenced to death by hemlock poisoning, to be carried out after the return of the sacred ship from Delos, a religious festival during which no executions could be performed. The ship had departed the day before his trial, and its return depended on winds and seas. The delay would last about 30 days. 30 days for Socrates to contemplate his approaching death. 30 days for his friends to try once more to convince him to escape. 30 days for Athens to wonder whether it had made the right decision. Socrates remained in prison, and each day his friends came to visit, to talk, to be in his presence while they still could. They found him remarkably unchanged. He was the same Socrates they had always known, asking questions, making jokes, discussing philosophy, apparently unconcerned about his approaching execution. Some found this reassuring, others found it disturbing. Was he truly unafraid, or was he suppressing fear through philosophical discipline? Was this courage or denial? One morning, his wealthy childhood friend Crito arrived early, before dawn. He found Socrates sleeping peacefully, and he waited, watching his old friend rest, knowing that soon this would be impossible, that soon Socrates would be dead, and Crito would have to live with whatever decision was made in this cell. When Socrates woke, Crito told him everything was ready. The plan was more detailed now, more concrete than the vague proposals of earlier visits. Guards had been bribed, specific men, specific amounts. A ship was waiting at Piraeus, provisioned for a voyage to Thessaly. Crito had spoken to friends in Thessaly who would welcome Socrates, who would provide a house, protection, everything he needed. The escape would happen tonight. Socrates simply needed to agree. Crito spoke urgently, passionately. "Think of your sons," he said. "They need a father. Think of your friends. We will be devastated, and people will think we valued our money more than your life, that we could have saved you, but chose not to spend what was necessary. Think of the injustice. You are innocent, and Athens is wrong to execute you. Why should you cooperate with injustice? And think of what will happen if you die," Crito continued. "Your enemies will rejoice. Your students will be scattered. Your philosophical mission will end. All the work you have done, all the questions you have raised, all the minds you have influenced, all of it will be diminished by this death." Socrates listened patiently, then began to respond. But he did not respond with emotional appeals of his own. He did what he always did. He started asking questions. Should we care what most people think, or should we care about what is right? The many can kill us, but they cannot make us do wrong. Our concern should be living justly, not surviving at any cost. But Crito, if we escape, are we acting justly? Let us examine this together. Socrates' answer, preserved in Plato's dialogue Crito, reveals the deepest principles of his philosophy. He asked Crito to imagine the laws of Athens themselves speaking to him. What would the laws say if he escaped? The laws would say, Socrates, we raised you, we protected you, we gave you education, security, the opportunity to live a good life. You could have left Athens at any time. We never compelled you to stay. By remaining, by raising your children here, by participating in the city's life for 70 years, you entered into an agreement with us, and now, when we render a judgment you dislike, you want to break that agreement? If you destroy us by disobeying, what happens to law itself? If every man who thinks a verdict unjust simply flees, what becomes of justice? What becomes of the city? Cities depend on the authority of law. If citizens pick and choose which laws to obey based on whether they agree with them, law becomes meaningless. You have always claimed to value justice above all else, Socrates. You have spent your life telling others that it is better to suffer injustice than to commit it, that we should never do wrong even in response to wrong done to us. Will you abandon that principle now, when it costs you your life? And what about where you would go? Thessaly is notorious for lawlessness and disorder. You would arrive as a fugitive, an old man with no resources. How would you live? What would you teach? That you abandoned your principles to save your skin. What authority would you have to question others about virtue when you fled rather than face the consequences of your convictions? Think about your sons. You say you care about them, but is it better for them to have a father who lived as a fugitive and coward, or to have the memory of a father who died with integrity? Which example will serve them better? This was Socrates' reasoning. He would not escape because escape would be unjust. It would destroy the laws. It would make him a hypocrite. Everything he had taught, everything he had stood for, would be revealed as hollow if he fled to save his skin. Better to die unjustly than to live by committing injustice himself. The reasoning may seem strange to us. We live in societies where civil disobedience is recognized as sometimes necessary, where unjust laws are challenged and resisted. But Socrates drew a distinction. He had disobeyed the 30 tyrants because they had no legitimate authority, because they had suspended law rather than embodied it. But the democratic court that sentenced him, however wrongly, was legitimate. Its verdict, however unjust, came through proper legal processes. To flee would undermine not just this verdict, but the entire system of law. Crito left without him, weeping, knowing his friend had chosen death. The days passed slowly. Socrates' friends continued to visit, and he continued to philosophize, to discuss virtue and knowledge and the nature of reality, as if he had all the time in the world. Some days the conversations were frustrating. Socrates would lead them into dead ends, show them they did not understand what they thought they understood, leave them more confused than before. Other days they felt they were approaching something profound, some insight that would make sense of everything. And then, on the final day, the ship from Delos was sighted in the harbour. The religious festival was complete. The prohibition on executions was lifted. The execution would happen that evening. Socrates' friends gathered in the prison cell one last time. They found him remarkably calm, almost cheerful, as if this were any other day. Xanthippe was there with their youngest son, still an infant. Socrates spoke with her briefly, held the child, but then asked her to leave. He did not want his final hours disturbed by grief and lamentation. Xanthippe left weeping, the baby in her arms, crying out Socrates' name, making a scene that embodied all the pain Socrates was trying to avoid. It was the last time he saw his wife and child. And then Socrates did what he had always done. He began a philosophical discussion. The topic was immortality. Did the soul survive the death of the body? Could there be knowledge after death? What arguments could be made for the soul's existence, independent of matter? These were not idle questions in the moment. Socrates was hours away from finding out the answers, if answers existed. The conversation had urgency beyond typical philosophical discourse. For hours, they debated. Socrates proposed arguments for the soul's immortality. The soul is invisible and unchanging, while the body is visible and constantly changing. Things that are composite can be decomposed, but the soul is simple. The soul is the source of life, and nothing can contain its opposite. Snow cannot be hot, fire cannot be cold, and the soul cannot be dead. His friends raised objections. These arguments seemed clever but not conclusive. Perhaps the soul was like a harmony, dependent on the body as music is dependent on the lyre. When the lyre is destroyed, the music ceases. When the body dies, perhaps the soul ceases too. Socrates responded to each objection, refined his arguments, acknowledged problems. It was exactly like every other philosophical conversation they had shared, except that this one would end with Socrates drinking poison. The dialogue wove through complex territory. They discussed Pythagorean mathematics, the theory of forms, epistemology, the nature of change. They touched on why philosophy involves preparing for death, why true philosophers are always practicing dying by separating their souls from bodily concerns. Some of his friends broke down. They could not maintain philosophical composure in the face of what was about to happen. Apollodorus, who had been weeping throughout, finally burst out in open lamentation. But Socrates gently chided them. Where was their courage? Where was their commitment to reason? Death was either a good or neutral. There was no rational basis for grief. It is better, Socrates said, to die well than badly. I have lived my life in a certain way, and I will die in that same way. No weeping, no loss of control, no abandoning reason at the last moment. As the sun began to set, the jailer arrived. He was weeping. He told Socrates he was the noblest, gentlest, best man who had ever come to the prison. He had served as jailer for years, had overseen many executions, but never before had he met someone like Socrates. He dreaded what he had to do. Then the servant entered, carrying the cup of hemlock. Socrates asked the jailer how to proceed. The man explained, "Drink the poison, walk around until your legs feel heavy, then lie down." The poison would spread from the extremities to the heart. When it reached the heart, death would come. It would be peaceful, relatively quick. There would be some discomfort, but no agony. Socrates took the cup without hesitation, with no trembling in his hands, no change in his expression. His friends begged him to delay. He could wait a bit longer, drink later, take a few more minutes of life. But Socrates said there was no point in clinging to life when death was inevitable. Better to get on with it. Delaying would only make him ridiculous, like an old man grasping at existence that was already over. He drank the poison calmly, steadily, as if it were wine at a symposium. He drained the cup completely. Then he began to walk around the cell, just as the jailer had instructed. His friends watched in anguish. This man they loved this teacher who had shaped their minds and lives, was pacing in a stone cell with poison spreading through his body. The normalcy of it was somehow worse than if he had been dramatically suffering. He walked as he always walked, spoke as he always spoke, treated his approaching death as just another interesting problem to observe. After a few minutes, Socrates said his legs felt heavy. He lay down on the cot on his back, his arms at his sides. His friends gathered around, not speaking now, just watching. The jailer returned periodically to check the poison's progress, pressing Socrates' feet and legs to test sensation. Gradually, the numbness spread upward. First the feet went numb, then the ankles, then the calves. The poison moved inexorably toward his heart. Socrates continued talking, continued teaching, even as the poison climbed through his body. He spoke about the soul's journey, about the nature of true knowledge, about the philosopher's task of separating soul from body. His voice remained steady, though his limbs were dying. And then, just before the end, he uncovered his face. He had drawn his cloak over it as the cold reached his torso, and said something strange. "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay it and do not neglect it." Asclepius was the god of healing. The sacrifice of a cock was the traditional thank-offering for recovery from illness. But Socrates was dying. What illness had he recovered from? Scholars have debated this for millennia. Some think Socrates meant that death itself was the cure, that life was the illness and death the healing. Others think it was a conventional piety, a final acknowledgement of the gods. Still others see it as ironic, a last gentle joke at the expense of those who claimed he did not believe in the gods. Some suggest it was a request for healing, for the illness that is mortal life itself, a prayer that his death would cure the fundamental problem of being trapped in a body. Crito assured him the debt would be paid. "Is there anything else?" he asked. There was no answer. The poison reached Socrates' heart. His body convulsed once, and then he was still. His friend Crito leaned forward and gently closed Socrates' eyes and mouth. Phaedo, who was present and later narrated the scene to others, said this: "Such was the end of our comrade, a man who, of all those we have known, was the best, and also the wisest and most just." The silence in the cell was absolute. Outside, the sun had set completely. Athens was dark. And in that underground chamber, the body of a 70-year-old philosopher lay on a simple cot, freed at last from the questions that had driven him, the mission that had defined him, the examined life that had ultimately cost him everything. News of Socrates' death spread quickly through Athens. Some rejoiced the troublemaker was finally silenced. The man who had embarrassed so many prominent citizens was gone. The dangerous influence on youth had been removed. But others, especially those who had known him, who had experienced the strange power of his questions, who had felt their minds opened by his relentless inquiry, felt a profound sense of loss. Athens had killed the man who asked it to examine itself. And in killing him, Athens had created something it did not intend, a martyr for philosophy, an example that would inspire and challenge thinkers for millennia, a question that would never be answered. What does it mean to live with integrity, to value truth more than life, to choose death rather than compromise, to examine life so thoroughly that you understand what matters and what does not? Socrates did not write down answers to these questions. He lived an answer. And in his death, that answer became permanent, irrefutable, undeniable. Multiple students of Socrates wrote accounts of his life and teachings. each trying to capture what they had witnessed, to make sense of the man who had shaped their minds and then chosen death rather than silence. Plato's dialogues became the most influential works of profound philosophical depth that used Socrates as a character to explore questions of justice, virtue, knowledge, and reality. Xenophon, less philosophically sophisticated but more concerned with historical accuracy, produced several works featuring Socrates and defending his reputation. Other students, Antisthenes, Aristippus, Euclides, Aeschines, founded their own philosophical schools, each claiming to represent the true Socratic legacy. This proliferation of Socratic schools reveals something important. Socrates himself never established a doctrine. He asked questions, he exposed contradictions, he claimed ignorance. But he never wrote down a system, never codified his beliefs, never created an institution to preserve his teachings. His philosophy was inseparable from his person, from the lived encounter with his questioning presence. This was deliberate. Socrates believed philosophy was an activity, not a body of knowledge. It happened in conversation, in the live encounter between minds. Writing could not capture this. Writing was static, dead. It could not respond to questions, could not adapt to the specific person receiving instruction. A written text could be misunderstood with no one to correct the misunderstanding. Writing was a tool for memory, perhaps, but not for genuine philosophical inquiry. So Socrates wrote nothing, and because he wrote nothing, we face what scholars call the Socratic problem. We have no direct access to his thought. Everything we know comes through others, primarily Plato, who was not an objective reporter but a brilliant philosopher in his own right, who used Socrates as a character to develop his own ideas. The Socrates of Plato's dialogues is almost certainly a mixture of the historical figure and Plato's own philosophical conclusions. We cannot separate them with certainty. The historical Socrates remains forever partially obscured behind the literary Socrates, the philosophical Socrates, the mythical Socrates that different writers created for different purposes. But some things are clear. The historical Socrates was executed in 399 BCE for questioning Athenian values. He refused to flee when escape was possible. He faced death calmly, without apparent fear, continuing to philosophize until the hemlock stopped his heart. And his death became, for later generations, a model of philosophical integrity, the philosopher who would rather die than compromise his principles. Within a decade of his death, Plato had founded the Academy in Athens, an institution that would last nearly 1,000 years and become the model for universities throughout the Western world. The Academy was not a building, but a philosophical community, a place where people gathered to ask questions, examine arguments, pursue truth collectively. And at its heart was the memory of Socrates, the man who claimed to know nothing, but taught everyone who encountered him. The major Hellenistic philosophical schools that emerged in the following centuries, Cynicism, Stoicism, Skepticism, even Epicureanism, all traced their lineage back to Socrates in different ways, all claimed to represent his true legacy. The Cynics emphasized his indifference to wealth and comfort, his willingness to live in poverty while pursuing virtue. The Stoics admired his rational control of emotion, his calmness in the face of death, his argument that virtue alone is sufficient for happiness. The skeptics developed his profession of ignorance into a comprehensive epistemology, arguing that certainty is impossible and wisdom consists in suspending judgment. Each school claimed to be the true heir of Socrates. Each emphasized different aspects of his life and method. And through these schools, Socratic philosophy spread throughout the Mediterranean world, influencing how people thought about ethics, politics, knowledge, and the nature of a good life. When Christianity emerged several centuries later, Early Christian writers saw parallels between Socrates and Jesus, both teachers who wrote nothing themselves but whose words were preserved by devoted followers, both executed by the state for blasphemy and corrupting people with new ideas. Both died for their beliefs rather than compromise. Both became martyrs whose deaths gave profound meaning to their lives and teachings. Justin Martyr, in the 2nd century CE, called Socrates a Christian before Christ, arguing that the divine Logos that became incarnate in Jesus had previously worked through Socrates, preparing the pagan world for the coming of Christianity. This comparison elevated Socrates' status further. He became not just a philosopher but a holy figure, a pagan saint, proof that divine wisdom operated outside the specific revelation of Scripture. Medieval and Renaissance Christians could admire Socrates without compromising their faith because his life demonstrated that human reason, properly used, pointed toward divine truth. During the Middle Ages, Socrates was largely known through Arab translations and commentaries. Islamic philosophers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna studied the Socratic method and incorporated it into their own work, using questioning and dialectic as tools for pursuing truth. When these texts were translated into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries, they reintroduced Socrates to medieval Europe, where he was admired as an example of natural reason operating at its highest level. The Renaissance saw a revival of interest in original Greek texts. Scholars could now read Plato directly rather than through intermediaries and translators. Socrates became a model of the examined life, the man who valued truth over comfort, who questioned authority, who followed reason wherever it led. Humanist scholars held him up as proof that ancient pagans had achieved moral excellence and philosophical wisdom independent of Christian revelation. During the Enlightenment, Socrates was claimed by rationalists as an early champion of reason against superstition. Voltaire admired his skepticism toward traditional religion and his willingness to question authority. Diderot praised his moral courage and his commitment to rational inquiry. The French Revolution saw Socrates as a martyr to tyranny, a victim of irrational authority, a hero who died rather than compromise his intellectual freedom. But the 19th century brought a darker reading. Nietzsche attacked Socrates as the man who killed tragedy, who replaced instinct with reason, who demanded that life justify itself before the tribunal of logic. Nietzsche saw Socratic rationalism as decadent, life-denying, hostile to the creative and instinctual forces that make human existence vital. By insisting that everything be examined, questioned, rationally justified, Socrates drained life of its spontaneity and joy. He turned philosophy against life itself, making reason the master rather than the servant of human flourishing. This was a profound challenge to the standard narrative. What if Socrates was not the hero of philosophy but its villain? What if his demand for definitions, for logical consistency, for examined lives, was actually hostile to human flourishing? What if the unexamined life was not only worth living but necessary for genuine vitality? The 20th century complicated the picture further with new readings and interpretations. Karl Popper saw Socrates as a liberal hero fighting against Platonic totalitarianism, arguing that the historical Socrates believed in democratic values while Plato corrupted his legacy. Hannah Arendt analyzed his trial as emblematic of the eternal conflict between philosophy and politics, between the private life of contemplation and the public life of action. I.F. Stone published a controversial book arguing that the Athenians had legitimate reasons to execute Socrates, that he was genuinely dangerous to democracy, that his aristocratic associations and anti-democratic arguments made him complicit in Athens' political disasters. Today, Socrates appears in virtually every introduction to philosophy course. Students encounter him in their first weeks of college, learning about the Socratic method, the the unexamined life, the gadfly of Athens. The Socratic method is taught in law schools worldwide as a technique for rigorous questioning and analysis. Socratic questioning is used in therapy, in education, in critical thinking training. His influence is pervasive, often invisible because it is so foundational. But what exactly is the Socratic method? Is it merely asking questions? Is it exposing contradictions in people's beliefs? Is it leading people to predetermined conclusions while pretending ignorance? Is it genuinely following arguments wherever they lead, even into aporia and confusion? The method has been formalized in ways Socrates himself might not recognize. Modern implementations often lose what made Socratic questioning genuinely philosophical, the willingness to follow the argument wherever it leads, even if the destination is confusion rather than certainty, even if the result is recognizing how little we know rather than learning new things. Because Socrates did not always reach positive conclusions. Many of his conversations end in aporia, puzzlement, dead ends, acknowledgement that the question remains unanswered. This is not a failure of method, but its point. The first step toward wisdom is recognizing what you do not know. False knowledge is worse than acknowledged ignorance. Better to be confused than confidently wrong. Contemporary ethical debates still revolve around questions Socrates raised more than 2 millennia ago. What is justice? Can virtue be taught? Is it better to suffer wrong than to commit it? Should we obey unjust laws? What do we owe to the state? What makes a life worth living? None of these questions has been definitively answered. Socrates left them open, and they remain open today, as urgent and unresolved as they were in ancient Athens. Consider the question of civil disobedience. Socrates argued in the Crito that he must obey Athens' laws even when they condemn him unjustly, because disobeying would destroy the legal system itself. But Socrates also disobeyed the 30 tyrants when they ordered him to arrest Leon of Salamis. When is obedience to law required? When is disobedience justified? Socrates himself seems to have acted on both principles at different times, and he never fully reconciled them. Perhaps they cannot be reconciled. Perhaps we must always decide case by case, balancing our obligations to law against our obligations to justice. Or consider his claim that no one does wrong willingly, that all wrongdoing stems from ignorance. If people truly understood what was good for them, Socrates argued, they would never choose evil. Evil is always a mistake, a failure of knowledge. We pursue pleasure thinking it will make us happy, but we are ignorant of what true happiness requires. We seek wealth thinking it will provide security, but we do not understand that virtue is the only real security. This idea is profoundly counterintuitive. We feel that people often know what is right but choose wrong anyway out of weakness, or malice, or self-interest. But Socrates insisted that this is impossible. If you truly know the good, if you understand it deeply rather than superficially, you will do it. Apparent weakness or malice is actually ignorance in disguise. People who do wrong do not fully understand what they are doing or what the consequences will be. Is he right? The question remains contested. Modern moral philosophy divides between those who think Socrates correct, that moral knowledge is sufficient for moral action, and those who think he ignored the phenomena of acrasia, weakness of will, the gap between knowing and doing. Or consider his daimonion, the divine sign or inner voice that, according to Socrates, warned him away from certain actions throughout his life. It never told him what to do, only what not to do. It was a preventative rather than directive voice. It stopped him from entering politics, from certain personal decisions, from fleeing Athens when escape was possible. What was this? A genuine supernatural experience? An intuition rationalized as divine? An early conception of conscience? Socrates himself seemed uncertain how to describe it, except to say it had guided him since childhood and had never led him wrong. The Athenians saw it as evidence of introducing new divinities, one of the charges at his trial. But Socrates insisted it confirmed his piety rather than undermining it. The gods cared enough about him to send warnings. It proved he had a relationship with the divine, even if that relationship did not conform to conventional religious practices. These ambiguities and contradictions are not weaknesses in Socrates' philosophy, they are its strength. Socrates did not offer a system that answered every question neatly. He offered a method of inquiry that generated better questions, that opened up thinking rather than closing it down. And the central question, the one that structures his entire life, remains as urgent today as it was in 399 BCE. What does it mean to live a good life? Not a successful life measured by wealth, status, or power. Not a happy life in the conventional sense of pleasure or contentment, but a good life, a life worth living, a life that can withstand examination and not be found wanting. Socrates' answer was clear: the examined life. The life that asks questions about its own values, that refuses to accept conventional wisdom uncritically, that pursues truth even when truth is uncomfortable, that values integrity more than success. But this answer raises further questions. How much examination is required? Can you examine too much, think too much, question until action becomes impossible? Socrates himself was accused of this, of talking endlessly without doing anything concrete to improve Athens, of questioning everything but building nothing, of tearing down beliefs without offering alternatives. And what about those who lack the intellectual capacity or education to examine their lives philosophically? Does Socrates' standard condemn them to worthless lives? Is philosophical examination an elitist standard accessible only to the educated few who have leisure and training for such pursuits? Socrates would probably respond that anyone can ask questions, that philosophy requires no special training, that the examined life is available to all, regardless of education or social class. But this response underestimates the barriers, social, economic, educational, that prevent many people from engaging in sustained philosophical reflection. A peasant working from dawn to dusk for bare subsistence does not have time for philosophical conversations in the agora. A slave has no freedom to question the values of his society. A woman in ancient Athens, confined to the household and excluded from public life, cannot pursue wisdom in the marketplace. There is also the question of Socrates' actual impact on those closest to him. His own sons, by multiple accounts, were unremarkable men who accomplished nothing notable. His most famous students included Alcibiades, who betrayed Athens to its enemies, and Critias, who imposed tyranny and murdered citizens. If Socrates was such a great moral teacher, why did his teaching fail so spectacularly in these cases? One response: Socrates never claimed to teach virtue. He only claimed to examine claims to knowledge. He was a midwife, helping others give birth to ideas, but he could not control what those ideas would become or how people would act on them. He could show people their ignorance, but he could not force them to pursue wisdom. He could demolish false beliefs, but he could not install true ones in their place. Another response: Alcibiades and Critias were not failures of Socratic education, but confirmations of it. They understood Socrates' critiques of democracy and conventional morality. They grasped his arguments that expertise should rule rather than majority opinion. They simply drew the wrong conclusions, that power should be seized rather than examined, that the strong should rule rather than serve wisdom, that if conventional morality was unjustified, then anything was permitted. Socrates himself, when asked about Alcibiades' betrayal, reportedly said that he had loved Alcibiades' soul, not his body, that he had hoped to make Alcibiades better, that he had failed in this, but the attempt was still worthwhile, That you fail to achieve a good does not mean pursuing it was wrong, but this raises uncomfortable possibilities. What if Socratic questioning, far from improving people, actually destabilizes them? What if exposing the contradictions in conventional morality without providing an alternative creates moral confusion that makes people more rather than less likely to act badly? What if demonstrating that no one really understands justice or virtue leads not to humility and further inquiry, but to cynicism and nihilism? Some of Socrates' critics in Athens argued exactly this. They saw him not as a moral reformer, but as a moral corrupter, someone who destroyed people's confidence in traditional values without giving them anything to replace those values. Young men who spent time with Socrates became difficult, disrespectful, contemptuous of their fathers and the city's traditions. And what did they gain? Confusion. The knowledge that no one, including Socrates, actually knew what virtue was or how to live well. Was this a fair criticism? Socrates would say no. He would argue that false confidence is worse than acknowledged ignorance, that people who think they know what justice is but actually do not are more dangerous than people who recognize their confusion. At least the confused can search for truth. The falsely confident will act on error with conviction, causing harm while believing themselves righteous. But this is ultimately an empirical question, and we lack the data to settle it conclusively. We cannot run controlled experiments on whether Socratic education produces better people. We have only individual cases, and those cases are ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations. What we can say is that Socrates himself lived according to the principles he advocated. He examined his own life relentlessly. He was willing to die rather than abandon that examination. And his death demonstrated that philosophical integrity can cost everything. This is perhaps his most lasting legacy, not a set of doctrines, not a philosophical system, not even a method that can be reduced to simple rules, but an example. The example of someone who took ideas seriously enough to die for them. In an age of irony and cynicism, when commitment is often treated as naivety and belief is suspect, when the examined life is praised in theory but rarely practiced, this example retains extraordinary power. We live in a world where politicians speak in focus-grouped talking points designed to offend no one, where corporations optimize for quarterly earnings regardless of long-term consequences, where social media rewards performance over authenticity, where convenience is valued more than principle. Against this backdrop, Socrates stands as a permanent reproach. He reminds us that truth matters more than approval, that integrity matters more than success, that some things are worth dying for. But he also reminds us how difficult this is. Socrates was not superhuman. He had a family he neglected. He made enemies who eventually killed him. He spent his final years walking around Athens asking questions that annoyed people. He died condemned by his own city. His life's work apparently failed. And yet here we are, more than 2,000 years later, still talking about him, still reading the dialogues that feature him, still asking the questions he raised, still wondering what the examined life means and whether we have the courage to live it. Athens is long gone. The democracy that executed him collapsed within a century. The empires that succeeded it, Macedonian, Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, have all crumbled into dust. The Parthenon that was being completed when Socrates was young is now a ruin. The long walls that protected Athens are gone. The ships that ruled the Aegean are wrecks on the seafloor. Everything that seemed permanent in Socrates' time has disappeared. But Socrates remains. Why? Because the questions he asked are permanent. Every generation must ask them anew. What is justice? What is virtue? How should we live? What do we owe to others? What matters? These are not questions that can be answered once and for all and then forgotten. They must be continually re-examined, rethought, tested against new circumstances and new challenges. Socrates understood this. That is why he wrote nothing. Writing freezes thought, makes it static. But philosophy is living inquiry, ongoing examination. It happens in the conversation, in the moment of questioning, in the encounter between minds seeking truth together. And that encounter can still happen. We can still read Plato's dialogues and feel ourselves pulled into the argument, feeling Socrates' questions directed at us across the millennia. We can still recognize ourselves in the people Socrates questions, confident in our beliefs until someone asks us to explain them, unable to give a coherent account of what we claim to know. The Socratic method is not just a pedagogical technique. It is a way of being in the world. It is a commitment to questioning rather than asserting, to examining rather than assuming, to acknowledging ignorance rather than pretending wisdom. This is enormously difficult. Our brains are not wired for it. We want certainty, not questions. We want answers, not further puzzles. We want to belong, to fit in, to avoid the ostracism that awaits those who question too much. Social pressure rewards conformity, rewards not making waves, rewards accepting what everyone else accepts. Socrates knew this. He knew his questioning made people uncomfortable. He knew he was making enemies. He knew the oracle's mission would eventually cost him his life. He did it anyway. Return now to the prison cell. The hemlock has spread through Socrates' body. His friends watch in anguish as the numbness climbs from his feet toward his heart. His last words, "We owe a cock to Asclepius," hang in the air, cryptic, unexplained. What did he mean? Perhaps he meant that death was healing, that life itself was the illness from which death offered release. This would fit with his argument in the Phaedo that the soul is imprisoned in the body, that true philosophers spend their lives preparing for death by separating their souls from bodily concerns as much as possible. Or perhaps it was simpler. Perhaps he was acknowledging that the gods, whom he was accused of not believing in, had kept their promise. The oracle said no one was wiser than Socrates. Socrates spent 40 years testing that claim through exhaustive inquiry. In the end, he concluded it was true, but not because he possessed wisdom, because he alone recognized his ignorance. The gods had given him a puzzle. He had solved it. Now he was paying the traditional debt of gratitude for divine guidance received. Or perhaps, and this seems most consistent with everything we know about Socrates, it was all of these things at once. A final joke, a final piety, a final lesson. Death as healing. Philosophy as divine service. Gratitude even in execution. An acknowledgement that everything that had happened, even this unjust death, was somehow part of a larger pattern he could not fully understand but trusted was meaningful. We cannot know, and perhaps we are not meant to know. Perhaps the mystery is the point. Perhaps Socrates' final act was to leave us with one more question, one more puzzle, one more reminder that certainty is elusive and wisdom consists in recognizing how much we do not know. What we do know is that when Socrates died, something changed in human consciousness. Before Socrates, philosophers studied the cosmos, asking what the world was made of and how it operated. After Socrates, philosophers studied themselves, asking how to live and what made life worth living. Before Socrates, wisdom meant knowing things about the external world. After Socrates, wisdom meant knowing yourself, understanding your own ignorance, examining your own life. Before Socrates, education meant transmitting knowledge from teacher to student. After Socrates, education meant drawing out knowledge that already existed within the student, helping them recognize what they already implicitly knew. These changes did not happen because Socrates wrote treatises or founded a school or created a doctrine. They happened because he lived a certain kind of life and died a certain kind of death, because he embodied the principles he espoused, because he showed that philosophy was not abstract speculation but existential commitment. He showed that ideas had consequences. That truth was worth dying for. That integrity was possible even when it cost everything. This is what makes his death more than just a historical event. It is a permanent challenge to anyone who thinks about thinking, who questions authority, who pursues truth. Are you willing to follow the argument wherever it leads, even if it leads to your own destruction? Are you willing to acknowledge ignorance rather than pretend wisdom? Are you willing to examine your life, knowing that examination might reveal how poorly you have lived? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions Socrates asked every person he met. They are the questions his death asks us still, and they do not have comfortable answers. Consider what Socratic examination would mean in contemporary life. Imagine applying it systematically to your beliefs about politics, religion, ethics, relationships, career, meaning. Imagine questioning every assumption, following every contradiction, refusing to accept any claim you could not defend rationally. How many of your beliefs would survive? How many of the things you are confident about could you actually justify if pressed? How much of what you think you know is actually unexamined convention, inherited prejudice, comfortable self-deception? This is what Socrates offers, not answers, but rigorous, unsparing self-examination. And most people, most of the time, do not want this. They want certainty, not questions. They want to believe they are right, not to discover they are wrong. They want to be left alone to live their lives, not challenged to justify every choice and belief. The Athenians who voted to execute Socrates were not monsters. They were ordinary people who wanted him to stop questioning, to stop making them uncomfortable, to stop exposing the foundations of their beliefs as shaky. They wanted to get on with their lives without someone constantly asking why they lived that way. We are those Athenians. Every time we refuse to examine our assumptions, every time we dismiss challenging questions as impractical or irrelevant, every time we choose comfortable certainty over difficult truth, we vote to execute Socrates again. But there is another possibility. We can also choose to be Socrates' students. We can embrace the discomfort of examination. We can acknowledge our ignorance. We can commit to following arguments wherever they lead. This does not mean abandoning all beliefs or falling into paralysis. It means holding beliefs lightly, being willing to revise them, testing them constantly against experience and reason. It means treating knowledge as provisional, always subject to correction and refinement. It means valuing truth more than victory, understanding more than being right. This is hard. Socrates knew it was hard. That is why so few people practice it genuinely. But those who do practice it join a tradition that stretches back 24 centuries, a tradition of people who would rather think than accept, who value questions more than answers, who are willing to suffer rather than stop examining. Socrates was the first of them, or rather, he was the first we know about, the first whose example was preserved and transmitted and became foundational for all subsequent philosophy. But he was not the last. Every generation produces people who ask uncomfortable questions, who challenge authority, who refuse to accept conventional wisdom, who are willing to suffer for truth. These people are always minorities. They are often persecuted. They rarely achieve worldly success, and most of them are forgotten. But occasionally one becomes memorable. Their questions prove so fundamental, their integrity so complete, their examples so compelling, that they transcend their historical moment and speak to all subsequent generations. Socrates is the archetype of this figure, the questioner who will not stop questioning, the thinker who will not stop thinking, the examiner who will not stop examining, the man who values truth more than life, And his final question, the one posed by his death, remains open. What are you willing to die for? Not what are you willing to kill for? That is an easier question, and history is full of people eager to answer it, eager to impose their beliefs on others through violence. But what would you die for without killing anyone else? What principle matters so much that you would accept death rather than abandon it? Socrates' answer was truth, or rather, the pursuit of truth, the examined life, the relentless questioning of all claims to knowledge, including his own. He pursued this for 40 years. It made him poor, neglectful of family, friendless among the powerful, mocked in the theatre, eventually condemned in court, and when given the chance to escape, to save his life at the cost of abandoning his mission, he refused. He drank the hemlock, and in drinking it, he became immortal. Not because his soul survived in some afterlife, we cannot know that, and Socrates himself admitted he did not know, but because his example survived, the example of someone who lived what he believed, who followed his principles to their ultimate conclusion, who showed that philosophy is not academic abstraction but lived commitment. This is what Athens killed when it killed Socrates. And this is what Athens paradoxically preserved by making him a martyr, by forcing him to demonstrate his integrity through death. Athens ensured he would never be forgotten. If Socrates had fled to Thessaly, lived out his remaining years in comfortable exile, died peacefully in old age, he would have been just another philosopher. Interesting, perhaps. Worth a footnote in history. But the flight would have undermined everything he taught. It would have shown that when the stakes were ultimate, when death was the alternative, Socrates chose survival over principle. But he stayed. He died, and the death transformed him from a memorable teacher into an eternal symbol. It made his questions urgent rather than academic. It proved he meant what he said. It demonstrated that the examined life was not just a theoretical ideal, but a practical commitment worth dying for. And so we return, finally, to the question we began with: what does a man who knows nothing know about death? Socrates claimed to know he did not know. He claimed ignorance about nearly everything, but his actions at the end suggest he knew something the rest of them did not. He knew that some things matter more than life, that truth matters more than survival, that integrity matters more than safety. He knew that a life spent in genuine inquiry is worth living, and a life spent in comfortable self-deception is not. He knew that death is not the worst thing that can happen to a person. Living in a way that contradicts your deepest beliefs, compromising your integrity to gain safety or comfort, that is worse than death. These are not abstract philosophical claims that can be proven through argument. They are existential commitments, demonstrated through action. You can only know if someone truly believes these things by watching what they do when the stakes are ultimate, when survival depends on abandoning principle. Socrates' friends watched. They saw him walk around the cell as the poison spread. They saw him continue teaching even as his legs went numb. They saw him refuse to grieve, refuse to rage, refuse to regret. They saw him die as he had lived, questioning, examining, seeking truth. And they spent the rest of their lives trying to understand what they had witnessed, trying to preserve the memory of this extraordinary man, trying to answer the questions he had raised. Plato wrote dialogue after dialogue, trying to capture what Socrates was, what he meant, what his death revealed about how life should be lived. He never quite succeeded, no one could, but the attempt created Western philosophy as we know it. Xenophon wrote his memoirs trying to defend Socrates' reputation, to show he was pious and moral and beneficial to the city rather than dangerous and corrupting. He wanted Athens to regret what it had done, Antisthenes took Socrates' indifference to wealth and comfort and pushed it to its extreme, founding cynicism, the philosophy of living like a dog, owning nothing, needing nothing, finding freedom in absolute poverty. Aristippus took Socrates' focus on the present moment and turned it into hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure, since tomorrow we may die as Socrates did, and all we truly have is this moment. Each of them found something different in Socrates. Each emphasized different aspects of his teaching and example. And through their disagreements, through their competing interpretations, Socratic philosophy spread and diversified and became the foundation of Western thought. But beneath all the interpretations, beneath all the schools and doctrines and systems, there remains the simple fact of a man who drank poison rather than stop asking questions. That image is enough. Everything else is commentary. We do not need to solve the Socratic problem. We do not need to separate the historical Socrates from Plato's Socrates. We do not need to answer all his questions or resolve all his paradoxes. We only need to ask, am I willing to examine my life? Am I willing to acknowledge my ignorance? Am I willing to follow truth wherever it leads, even if it leads somewhere uncomfortable? These are Socrates' questions. They are questions he asked Athens 24 centuries ago. They are questions he asks us still, and they remain unanswered, not because we lack the intellectual capacity to answer them, but because answering them requires more than intellect. It requires courage. It requires integrity. It requires a willingness to die rather than compromise. Most of us do not have that willingness. Most of us would flee to Thessaly. Most of us would propose an acceptable counter-penalty. Most of us would stop questioning when questioning became dangerous. And this is fine. Not everyone needs to be Socrates. Not everyone should be Socrates. The world would be chaos if everyone walked around asking everyone else to define their terms and justify their beliefs. But someone needs to ask those questions. Someone needs to examine lives. Someone needs to refuse comfortable certainty in favor of difficult truth. Socrates was that someone for Athens. And through Athens, for all subsequent generations, his questions survive because they cannot be answered finally. Each generation must wrestle with them anew. Each person must decide for themselves what the examined life means, what truth requires, what they are willing to die for. And when you make that decision, when you really make it, not just as an intellectual exercise, but as an existential commitment, you join the tradition Socrates founded, the tradition of the examined life, the tradition of knowing that you do not know, the tradition of questioning authority, including your own authority over yourself. This is Socrates' legacy, not a doctrine, not a system, not a set of conclusions, a question mark, permanent, irremovable, challenging every certainty. And in that prison cell, 24 centuries ago, a 70-year-old man with numb legs and a cup of hemlock showed what it means to live that question mark all the way to death. He remained calm. He remained rational. He remained himself, the questioner, the examiner, the one who knew he knew nothing. And when the poison reached his heart, when Crito closed his eyes, when his friends wept for the man they would never see again, something paradoxical happened. The man who claimed to know nothing taught his final lesson. He taught them, taught us, that integrity is possible, that truth is worth pursuing, that death is not defeat. He taught them that an examined life, honestly lived, is worth more than all the unexamined lives in Athens. He taught them that philosophy is not what you think, but how you live. And he taught them by dying the same way he taught by living, through questions, not answers. His last words were a question disguised as a statement. We owe a cock to Asclepius. What did he mean? Why that God? Why that sacrifice? Why that moment for this particular utterance? We do not know. He did not explain. He died, leaving them, leaving us, with one more puzzle to solve. This was characteristic. This was perfect. This was Socrates, the man who died asking questions, the man who turned his death into a lesson about how to live, the man who knew nothing except that death was not to be feared, that truth was worth dying for, that an examined life was the only life worth living. Athens killed him, but it could not kill the questions he asked. Those questions are alive still, waiting for anyone brave enough to face them. What is justice? What is virtue? What do we owe to ourselves and others? How should we live? What makes life worth living? And the hardest question, the one Socrates spent his life asking, the one his death forces us to confront. Are you willing to examine your life, knowing that you might not like what you find? Are you willing to acknowledge your ignorance rather than pretend wisdom? Are you willing to follow truth wherever it leads, even if it leads to your own destruction? Socrates answered yes. He answered yes for 40 years, in thousands of conversations to anyone who would engage with his questions. And when the moment came to prove it, when the jury condemned him, when his friends offered escape, when the jailer brought the poison, he answered yes one final time. He drank the hemlock, he died. And in dying, he gave us a gift we have never fully appreciated. The gift of knowing that intellectual integrity is possible, that truth can be loved more than life, that examination is worth whatever it costs. This gift does not make life easier. Socrates never promised to make life easier. He promised to make it better, more honest, more examined, more worth living. And he kept that promise all the way to the end. The cell is silent now, the body lies still. The friends have departed, carrying with them the weight of what they witnessed. Outside, Athens continues. Life goes on. Tomorrow there will be markets and politics and all the ordinary business of the city. Most Athenians will never know that today something extraordinary happened in that prison cell, but for those who were there, for those who watched Socrates drink the poison, nothing will ever be the same. They have seen what a human being can be, how much courage is possible, how complete integrity can be, how calmly one can face death when life has been lived according to principle. They will spend the rest of their lives trying to live up to that example. They will fail, as everyone fails, but the attempt will shape them, will shape philosophy, will ultimately shape how humanity thinks about thinking, because that is what Socrates gave us, not answers about the cosmos or the gods or the nature of reality, but a way of thinking about thinking, a commitment to examination, a refusal to accept comfortable lies. The lamp oil burns low in the cell. Soon darkness will be complete. But the questions Socrates asked will continue echoing through the centuries, calling to anyone who has the courage to listen. What do you really know? How should you live? What are you willing to die for? These questions have no final answers, but they demand that we try to answer them, that we examine our lives, that we pursue truth, even when it is uncomfortable. And that is enough. That is what Socrates left us. That is what remains when everything else has fallen away. A question, a challenge, an example. The philosopher who chose death over silence. The man who showed us that some things matter more than survival. The teacher who taught his final lesson by dying well.